For centuries, Europe's greatest cities were not symbols of refinement or comfort. They were traps built of timber, stone, and decay. London, Paris, Florence, names that echo with power now. Yet in the Middle Ages, they often meant filth underfoot, sickness in the lungs, and death in the seams of everyday life. London in the 1300s pulsed with bodies. Around 80,000 to 100,000 people inside its walls, an enormous strain on a city never designed to hold so many. Entire families were packed inside narrow wooden homes that leaned closer each year, as if the buildings themselves were collapsing inward toward one another. Upper floors jutted out over alleyways, blocking out sunlight, trapping dampness, trapping rot. There were no sewers beneath the streets, no underground channels to carry away the waste of thousands, human excrement, chamber pot sludge, pig entrails, and butchers' remains were dumped directly into open drains, or simply thrown from windows into the street below. In many areas, the street itself acted as a slow-moving sewer, mud mixed with urine, blood, and garbage to create a thick black paste that clung to boots and bare feet. Dogs, pigs, and rats competed for the scraps. In 1310, royal ordinances in London attempted to restrict the dumping of waste into the Thames. Yet enforcement was almost non-existent. The river, which should have been a source of life, became a wide, flowing grave of contamination. Tanners soaked hides in urine. Butchers cleaned carcasses in its waters. Dyers emptied chemical waste into its current. Fishermen still pulled out eels and sold them. People still drank from it. And disease thrived. Typhoid fever, dysentery, cholera-like illnesses described by chroniclers long before modern medicine could name them. Children were especially vulnerable. In some sections of London and Paris, nearly half of children died before the age of 5. Not in great disasters, but in constant, ordinary tragedy. A cough that worsened, a fever that burned, a stomach sickness that emptied the body of all strength. The air was thick with smoke from coal and wood fires. Every home burned fuel for warmth and cooking, their chimneys spitting soot into the sky. In narrow streets, the smoke had nowhere to go. It clung to damp walls, hung low between buildings, burned the eyes, scarred the lungs day after day. And then there was London Bridge. By the early 13th century, the bridge was no longer just a crossing. It was a street floating above the river. Wooden buildings were raised along it, stacked like ribs on a spine. Shops, homes, bakeries, cloth sellers. More than 200 people lived above the flowing water. Cramped rooms, low ceilings, shared latrines that hung directly over the Thames. What when it dropped out below? The stench never lifted, even in winter. Fire was always waiting. Each house was a bundle of dry timber, wax, oil, straw, and cloth. Candles flickered on communal tables. Fires burned in hearths without proper chimneys. One careless moment, one fallen spark could erase an entire street. In 1212, a fire on London Bridge killed thousands as people were trapped between flames on both ends. In 1666, the Great Fire would become legendary. Yet centuries before that, smaller infernos devoured neighborhoods again and again. Paris was no kinder. By 1328, Paris had grown to roughly 200,000 people, one of the largest cities in Europe. Its streets were even narrower than London's, winding, windowless corridors of mud and debris. The Seine, thick with butchery waste and industrial runoff, glowed brown beneath stone bridges. Public complaints were constant. In 1292, officials attempted to regulate where waste could be dumped, but merchants and craftsmen ignored the rules. Profit outweighed health. Tanners soaked hides in vats of urine and lime. The process destroyed the air for miles around. Rotting organic matter soaked into the soil beside homes, and churches' gravediggers ran out of space. Mass graves became normal after major outbreaks. In the cemetery of the innocents, bodies were stacked in open pits until the ground physically rose from the weight of the dead. Priests walked among the sick. Doctors, bound by the limits of medieval understanding, blamed bad air, miasma, for the endless sickness. In one sense, they were not wrong. The very atmosphere was poison. Rats scurried along rooftops. Fleas rode their backs unseen. By 1348, the perfect host had been prepared. Florence, a city celebrated for art and intellect, also buried in filth and fear. By the early 14th century, Florence was an economic powerhouse, filled with cloth workers, merchants, and bankers. Yet its lower districts were blurred by desperate overcrowding. Workers slept in shifts to accommodate everyone who depended on a single space. Water was contaminated by dye vats from the wool industry. Stagnant canals crept through poor districts, turning green and foul in the summer heat. Then came the Black Death. 1348. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio would later describe the terror. For him, the city became a theater of abandonment. Parents fled children. The rich locked themselves indoors. The poor had nowhere to hide. Carcasses of both animals and people lay out in the open. Priests performed mass blessings over piles of bodies. No time for names, no time for prayer. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of Florence's population died within a single year. London, Paris, Florence. Each became silent in their own unbearable way. Church bells rang until the bell ringers themselves collapsed. Gravediggers worked until they fell into the same pits they had filled for others in some neighborhoods. No one remained to bury the dead. Houses stood open, tables still set, the echo of lives erased in weeks. Yet even before the plague, life in these urban slums was governed by desperation. Crime threaded through narrow lanes, petty theft, assault. Gangs ruled certain areas when the sun went down. Watchmen were few, bribery common, justice uneven. Public executions were staged, not just as punishment, but as warnings to those who dared test the city's fragile order. In 1381, the peasants' revolt sent shockwaves into London. Crowds roared through streets already cracked by inequality. Prisons were broken open, officials dragged into chaos for a moment. The powerless pressed against the walls of power, and then were crushed back down. The slums stretched wider. More migrants arrived from failed villages, people fleeing famine. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had already weakened entire populations. Rain fell without mercy. Grain rotted in fields. The starving flooded into cities hoping for food, but found only more mouths, more suffering. Blackened teeth, sunken eyes, bodies bent before their time. Yet still, the bells rang. The markets opened, the tanners worked, the butchers cut. The children played beside filth they could not recognize as danger. This was normal. This was life. This was the city. And beneath every step, beneath every whispered prayer, every desperate bargain, every fevered breath, the streets remembered those who had fallen before, layer by layer, soaked into the mud and stone. A civilization rising above a foundation of waste, built higher on history's refuse. Human life grinding forward, no matter the cost, no matter the stench, no matter the shadow creeping at every window. And still the cities grew. More bodies, more buildings, more smoke, more silence when the sickness returned. And it always returned. Water that should have meant life turned instead into a slow, breathing threat. In medieval Europe, the land did not always rise firm beneath the feet. In some places, it trembled, darkened, swallowed entire paths and voices. The fens of eastern England, the Pontine marshes of central Italy, the sprawling wetlands of the Danube basin, places where earth and water argued endlessly for control, and humans paid the price for standing between them. The fens stretching across what is now Cambridgeshire, Lincolnshire, and Norfolk once formed one of the most treacherous landscapes in England, a tangled world of shallow lakes, peat bogs, reed beds, and mist. In the early 13th century, travelers described it as a watery wilderness, where roads vanished beneath the surface and direction was guessed by the shapes of distant trees. Small islands of higher ground, called islets, became the only safe places for settlement. Villages clung there like survivors on floating wreckage. Winter rain turned narrow channels into flooded plains. Summer heat transformed stagnant pools into breeding grounds for insects that arrived in clouds. Mosquitoes gathered at dusk in a humming veil, their bites spreading what medieval people called marsh fever, shaking chills, burning skin delirium, an exhaustion so heavy it felt like the body was being dragged into the ground itself. Malaria, though unnamed in modern terms, moved silently through the region, striking farmers, fishermen, children, monks. Records from Ely Abbey during the 1100s and 1200s show constant interruptions to work during the warmer months. Entire communities weakened season after season. Livestock collapsed in muddy fields, sheep and cattle succumbed to disease carried by water and insects. The land that appeared fertile from a distance was a liar. Crops rotted before harvest or drowned beneath swelling floods. Attempts to tame these waters had begun long before medieval times. Roman engineers had once carved drainage channels through parts of England. Yet after the Roman withdrawal in the early 5th century, many of these systems fell into ruin. By the time medieval communities expanded into the lowlands, nature had already reclaimed what structure had been imposed upon it. Ditches filled, banks broke, peat rose and shifted, swallowing any boundary humans tried to draw. Men hired to dig new channels often vanished. Lost in bogs so deep they never surrendered what they took, skeletons would later be found preserved in dark peat, skin stretched tight, expressions frozen between breath and silence. Not victims of war, not saints, just workers consumed by the land that refused to support them. Across the sea in Italy, the Pontine marshes spread south of Rome, a region known since antiquity as a reservoir of death. Roman writers had already warned about it. Strabo described the area as nearly uninhabitable. Pliny the Elder wrote of the constant sickness afflicting those who dared to settle there. Even the Roman Empire, master of roads, aqueducts, and order, struggled to conquer this landscape. Drainage projects were proposed under Julius Caesar, attempted under various emperors, yet continually failed as canals filled and embankments collapsed. By the Middle Ages, these marshes had fallen fully into neglect. Stagnant water covered mile after mile. Villages that once survived at the edges were abandoned. Travelers avoided the region whenever possible, detouring for days simply to escape the poisoned air. In certain months, the land seemed to exhale sickness, a heavy, sweet, rotten scent rising from the water as the sun fell. Monasteries attempted limited settlements along higher strips of land. They built walls, cleared brush, tried to plant grain. Many failed. Priests wrote of fevers striking entire communities in a matter of days, skin drenched in sweat, minds fading into confusion, bodies laid out in rows beside chapels that echoed with unanswered prayers. The word malaria had not yet been formed. That would come centuries later from the Italian malaria, bad air. But the belief was already firm that the land exhaled something unseen, something toxic. Medieval medicine, bound to the theory of the four humors, could offer no true protection. Herbs were burned, scents were carried, incense filled the air in a desperate effort to overpower the rot. Yet the sickness remained. Then there were the wetlands of the Danube basin, stretching across Central and Eastern Europe, a vast, undulating network of floodplains tied to one of Europe's greatest rivers. In the Middle Ages, the Danube routinely broke its banks, turning fields into lakes, roads into choking swamps, entire hamlets into half-submerged skeletons of wood and straw. Seasonal flooding erased borders drawn on maps. Political lines meant nothing to a river that answered only to rain from the Alps and Carpathians. In one year, a village might sit safely above the water. In the next, it was surrounded by a pale, endless mirror that reflected only the sky and the drifting remains of barns, carts, livestock. Settlements here were never permanent in the true sense. People built knowing everything could be undone in a single week. Homes raised on stilts, paths made of bundled reeds, small boats were as essential as plows. Fishing and herding replaced consistent agriculture because seed could not trust the ground. In these border regions between Hungary, the Balkans, and what is now Romania, disease found easy movement. Trade routes cut through damp, insect-filled corridors. Merchants carried more than goods. They carried contamination. The same fever that struck one river settlement could appear weeks later hundreds of miles downstream. Graveyards crept toward the edges of the water, crosses leaning into the soft ground, some eventually tipping and disappearing beneath the surface as if the dead themselves were being claimed again. For those who lived in these marshlands, time was marked not only by seasons, but by illness, by floods, by disappearances. A child could walk into the reeds and never be seen again. A path used for decades could vanish beneath new growth. A strong man weakened after a single summer of fever and never fully walked upright again. Governments and kings heard of the suffering, but intervention was rare, too expensive, too uncertain, too dangerous. One failed drainage attempt could consume more lives than it saved in the 12th and 13th centuries. Only small, isolated efforts were made to control the wetland territories. Local lords built narrow dikes around personal farmland. Monks drained patches to grow reeds and barley, but the land always pressed back, seeping through cracks, breaking walls by slow, patient force. Fear clung to these places, not the sudden terror of war, but the long dread of slow destruction. No enemy army to see in the distance, no trumpet to warn of coming danger. Only the quiet knowledge that sickness was already present, that the water itself was an accomplice. Animals behaved differently near the marshes. Birds gathered in huge, restless flocks. Frogs sang through the night in a chorus that felt endless. Livestock resisted being led near certain pools, as if they sensed what humans refused to acknowledge. Yet people continued to return, continued to settle, because land elsewhere was scarce, controlled, claimed by nobility. The poor had fewer choices, and the desperate will always accept land that breathes poison into the dark. In the long nights, when mist crept over the water and wrapped the villages in silver silence, bells from distant churches reached faintly through the fog, not calling to worship, but marking the hours, reminding the living that time was still moving. Even if the land never truly changed, even if the fever was already returning. For centuries, hunger had visited Europe in waves, and people had learned to fear empty barns, thin animals, and skies that withheld kindness. Yet nothing prepared them for what arrived in the spring of 1315. Rain began to fall, not in storms that passed, but in a steady, punishing curtain that refused to lift. Fields that should have been ready for sowing turned into black lakes. Plows sank into mud. Seeds rotted in the ground before they ever had the chance to breathe. Peasants stood at the edges of their land, staring at water that should have meant promise, and felt only dread gathering behind their eyes. From England to Normandy, from Flanders to the German states, from the Low Countries into Scandinavia, the story repeated without mercy. Cold winds followed the rain. Unseasonable frost struck in early summer. Wheat collapsed under its own weight. Barley yellowed and died. Oats vanished in a standing water. The harvest of 1315 never truly arrived. By autumn, barns stood half empty. Animals were sold or slaughtered too early, their meat salted in desperation, their bones boiled for any lingering strength left inside them. The price of grain doubled, then tripled in England. The cost of wheat rose to nearly 3 times the normal rate. In France, bread became a luxury for those who had once taken it for granted in the countryside. People began pulling roots that had never been meant for human mouths. Chroniclers began to write in strained, shaking lines. Jean de Venette in France recorded the great mortality of the poor. And yet at first, death did not come in armies. It arrived as thinning bodies, sunken eyes, children whose cries grew softer each night. By early 1316, the rain returned, again and again and again. Fields that had barely begun to heal were wounded once more. Spring planting failed for the second year in a row. A disaster that might have been endured for one season hardened into something monstrous as it stretched into another. People ate the seed grain that should have secured the next harvest. Millennia of agricultural wisdom broken under the weight of survival. Farmers who consumed their last stores knew, with clear, lucid terror, that they were consuming their future as well. Horses collapsed in the traces, cows gave thin, watery milk before drying entirely. Sheep staggered across ruined pastures in Germany. Reports describe whole herds dying where they stood. In parts of Norway, livestock losses reached levels that would not be recovered for decades. Hunger began to corrode behavior. Theft rose. Violence flared. Those caught stealing bread were beaten or killed in public as warnings to others who had nothing left to lose. Parents abandoned children where monasteries or towns might take pity. Monks broke their vows of almsgiving simply because they had no alms left to give. Strong men fell in the streets, unable to stand, too weak to beg. In Flanders, records show people reduced to eating dogs, cats, and rats. In parts of Germany and Poland, stew was made from the hides of animals, from leather belts, from old shoes soaked for days until they could be chewed. In England, some turned to wild plants that ripped apart the stomach even as they quieted it. And then, in the quietest corners of the countryside, things were recorded that would never be spoken aloud for centuries. Cannibalism, not rumored, but written in monastic chronicles, the final, unspeakable act of desperation. Bodies of the newly dead were taken from roadsides and consumed. Children vanished in isolated areas, not in great numbers, but enough to carve these years into memory as something unspeakable. Even hardened scribes who had lived through war hesitated to place their quills to parchment, but some did, because history demanded witness. Social fabric tore away thread by thread. Manners that had functioned for generations collapsed as peasants died or fled. Fields went unworked. Villages shrank. The old and the young were the first to fade. In certain regions, up to 10% of the population is believed to have died during the Great Famine, a number that turned entire communities into shadows. In 1316, King Edward II of England ordered that grain be brought into the country from abroad. Ships came from Prussia and the Baltic. Yet the volume was never enough for the need. Transport itself cost lives as sailors fought disease and storms sent by the same unstable climate that caused the famine. Across Europe, the church called for fasting and prayer. The irony burned in silent hearts. People were already fasting, though not by choice. Masses were held in flooded churches, feet standing in cold, creeping water as voices asked heaven for mercy that did not come. By 1317, exhaustion had settled over the land like a second winter. Those who survived were changed, bones visible beneath skin, minds marked by memories of siblings and parents buried without markers, entire generations hollowed by what they had endured. Infants born in these years carried the weakness of famine into adulthood. A lifetime shortened before it began. Even as harvests slowly struggled back into existence, the damage remained carved into the earth, soil stripped of nutrients, tools broken. Workers gone. It took many regions more than a decade to return to stability. And just as the land began to heal, another shadow began to form in the east, silent, waiting. The Great Famine did not arrive alone in history. It weakened bodies, thinned populations, softened every barrier that once stood against disease. By the time ships would carry plague across the Mediterranean in the late 1340s, Europe was already scarred, already vulnerable. Peasants who had survived 1315 to 1317 stood in fields once again years later, hands in damp soil, hearing a familiar quiet carry on the wind, a silence that felt too similar to the one that came before loss. Bread returned, but fear remained. Children who had watched siblings starve grew into adults who hoarded grain. Mothers who once had full arms remembered the unbearable lightness of empty ones. Stories passed in whispers by hearth spoke of the year the rain never stopped, the year the land betrayed its own people, the year hunger ruled over kings and beggars alike. And even as new crops rose, even as livestock multiplied, even as markets buzzed once more, that memory lingered, woven in a song, prayer, custom, hidden beneath celebration. A knowledge that the earth could turn again, that the sky could close without warning, that the line between survival and ruin had already been crossed once before, and could be crossed again. Slow clouds gathered beyond the horizon, and the soil, still remembering the taste of too much rain, waited. Wind scraped the English-Scottish border as if it knew no allegiance, only the sound of hooves, steel, and hunger. A line drawn on parchment meant nothing to the men who rode at night, cloaked in wool and ash, faces hidden, blades strapped close to the body like second hearts. This strip of land, later called the Marches, lived in a permanent state of tension, where every hedge could hide a raider and every hilltop could bloom with smoke by dawn. By the late 1200s and into the 1300s, England and Scotland were locked in an almost unbroken chain of conflict. The Wars of Scottish Independence had begun in 1296 when Edward I of England marched north, seized Berwick-upon-Tweed, and slaughtered its inhabitants indiscriminately. Chroniclers recorded streets running with blood as soldiers moved house to house. The town was English one day, silent the next, and it was only the beginning. In 1297, William Wallace rose, and with him came retaliation so swift and so brutal that entire communities vanished without record. Fields turned black from repeated burnings, grain stolen before it could be harvested, animals driven off as spoils, not food. Every border village became a target, and every peasant home a temporary fortress of fear. Then in 1314, at Bannockburn, Scotland struck back. The English army crushed under Robert the Bruce's command, and the retaliation that followed didn't follow rules or honor. Borders were not military fronts. They were living spaces, families, children, old men. From that point on, raiding became a way of life. This was not organized battle, but sustained terror. Reivers from both sides, English and Scottish, rode across fields built by hands that had nothing to do with kings. They stole cattle, burned barns, cut down orchards that had taken decades to grow. A lifetime of work erased in minutes. Hostages were taken not for strategy, but for leverage and payment. Ransoms became routine, and in some cases, never came at all. Law meant nothing here. Sheriffs refused to travel into certain stretches of land after sunset. Church bells stopped ringing at night. Priests learned to hide the chalices and relics in the ground when hoofbeats echoed across stone. Every creak of a floorboard carried the weight of possibility. This was not war. It was existence under siege, year after year after year. Further east, the Crusader states stood as fragile slivers of European power in the Levant. Established after the First Crusade captured Jerusalem in 1099. Their foundations were carved from blood and pilgrimage. The county of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, each clung to existence, surrounded by forces far more familiar with the climate, the land, the routes. Settlers arrived on promises of land and salvation, only to find themselves living inside fortified settlements that existed like islands in a sea of hostility. In 1100s and 1200s, these settlements were constantly tested, sieges stretched on for months, water sources poisoned or diverted, trade routes severed. Villages on the edges of these Crusader territories endured the worst of it. 1 month controlled by a European lord, the next reclaimed by Muslim armies under leaders like Nur ad-Din or Saladin. In 1187, after the Battle of Hattin, Saladin captured Jerusalem. The shift in power unleashed chaos for rural populations. Christians, Muslims, Jews, none spared the rippling effects. Civilians were viewed as currency, terror as a tactic. Villages were emptied to deny resources to enemies, then repopulate when power shifted, then destroyed again. The earth itself began to feel temporary. Families learned not to grow attached to rooftops or wells or graves, because nothing stayed long enough to become sacred. And then the Iberian Peninsula, the Reconquista, a slow, violent transformation stretching across centuries. By the 1200s, Christian kingdoms like Castile, Aragon, and Portugal pushed against Muslim-controlled Al-Andalus cities like Córdoba, and Seville fell into Christian hands. But the land between the major cities, the border country, was shredded over and over again. A battlefield without a schedule, a frontier soaked into dust. In 1212, the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa weakened the Almohad Caliphate, opening massive shifts in control. But this wasn't liberation for the villagers caught between banners. This was exposure. A farmer who spoke Arabic might be forced to convert or flee when Christians arrived. Then years later, when Muslim forces returned, it was his Christian neighbor who vanished in the night. Knights rode out with banners, but behind them came looters, mercenaries, desperate men with torn allegiances and no pay. Rape was a weapon designed not just to harm the body, but to destroy the future of a community. Yet medieval records speak of it not with poetry, but with silence, implying its existence through mention of outrages, dishonor, broken households, because the chroniclers could not bear to describe what was so common that it had ceased to shock. From the Don River to the forests of Prussia, the Teutonic Knights expanded their campaigns in the north. Pagans forced into conversion or death, villages razed to remove resistance, borders blurred into violence that was both religious and political. In Livonia and Prussia during the 13th and early 14th centuries, communities vanished, replaced with fortresses bearing crosses, children baptized at sword's edge. The border moved, and with it, identity itself. The common thread across all of these lands was uncertainty. Living in a border zone in medieval times meant never trusting the sky, because smoke might appear at any hour, never trusting a stranger's accent, because it could decide life or death, never knowing if the crops you planted in March would be harvested by your own hands in August or by the soldiers who killed you before spring ended. The English-Scottish border hardened further into chaos in the late 1300s and 1400s. Families like the Armstrongs, Nixons, Grahams, and Elliots developed reputations that eclipsed loyalty to crown or flag. Each community became a miniature kingdom driven by survival. They forged alliances through marriages, betrayals through grudges, revenge passed down like inheritance. Every birth followed by the quiet knowledge that death would likely come by raiding, not illness. Castles along the border, like Wark, Carlisle, Berwick, Roxburgh, stood as stones in a bruised landscape, often besieged, reclaimed, lost again. In 1346, after the English victory at Neville's Cross, entire Scottish bands were taken prisoner. Ransoms paced generations, fathers traded land for sons, sons traded liberty for allegiance. And between all these great names and dates were people who never entered a single record, a woman who hid her child in a root cellar, a boy who learned to tell English from Scots by patterns of curses, an old man who sat at the same broken window every day, listening for hoofbeats that had stolen his entire family 20 years earlier. Borderlands created a type of person that history struggles to name. Not soldier, not peasant, not citizen. Only survivor. A living witness to power's most careless violence, for kings could sign treaties on July 20th, 1295, or November 23rd, 1215, but the men on the ground did not stop writing, did not stop burning, did not stop taking what they could carry. Even peace was unstable. A truce only meant that betrayal now came from behind. Markets held during ceasefires were fast-raided once merchants had gathered, church sanctuaries violated, because a border trains men to see opportunity in weakness and cruelty as currency. And so across fields in Northumberland, across valleys of the Levant, across the riverlines of Spain, lives flickered like wind-blown lamps, held in trembling hands, constantly relit, sometimes extinguished without a name, sometimes forgotten without a grave, always marked by the terrible awareness that home was not a place of safety, but a temporary pause between catastrophes, a breath caught between invasions, a shadow waiting for its next shape. The earth cracked open for silver long before it ever offered mercy. In the mountains of Saxony, on the border of what is now Germany and the Czech Republic, miners began pulling silver from the ground in the 12th century, and by 1168, near Freiburg, a discovery so rich it reshaped the region called men, women, and children into the mountains like iron filings to a magnet. The Holy Roman Empire wanted coin. Churches wanted tithes, princes wanted power, and all of them fed on what hid underground. Mining towns appeared almost overnight, wooden houses slammed together along muddy streets, makeshift chapels erected beside taverns thick with smoke. Air already carried a metallic scent that clung to clothing, hair, and skin. Beneath these streets, shafts plunged downward, narrow, unstable, supported by timber beams that groaned with every footstep above. Candles guttered in oxygen-thin tunnels. Every flicker came with a reminder that fire and darkness were equally fatal. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Saxon mines had grown deeper, following veins of silver and lead far below the surface, and deeper meant deadlier. Water seeped in constantly, forming black pools that swallowed unbraced steps. Miners fought it with primitive pumps, buckets, hand-carved drainage channels. But the earth always pressed back. Wood rotted, supports failed, and when a tunnel collapsed, sound never reached the surface. Men disappeared without ceremony, their lunch pails left behind beside the broken rock, their names spoken once in prayer, then buried under another day's labor. Children carried, or to the surface, thin arms wrapped around heavy baskets, small fingers scraped at rock to find traces of metal. Some were as young as 8, their spines bent early, lungs shaped by dust instead of air, by adolescence. Many already coughed blood, a slow, rasping sound that marked the beginning of the end, congestion, constant breathlessness, blackened mucus, what later generations would recognize as silicosis and heavy metal poisoning. But at the time, it was simply called the miner's sickness, a waiting sickness, a sentence with no fixed date. By 1470, Saxony had become one of Europe's most important silver-producing regions. The wealth rose upward. To dukes, to emperors, to the church, the suffering stayed buried. To the east in Poland, salt became its own form of suffering. The Wieliczka salt mine, operating since the 13th century near Krakow, cut into the earth like a descending cathedral, level after level carved by hand. Entire passageways shaped from salt crystal. The substance that preserved food, preserved empires, was carved by men whose own lives dissolved rapidly. Salt dust crept into eyes, split skin, cracked lips until they bled, water burned when it touched exposed wounds. It mixed with mineral residue and turned to acid on flesh. Brine dripped constantly from ceilings. The air tasted of corrosion. Tools rusted within days. Working hours inside the Wieliczka mine stretched from dawn until dark, though dark and dawn had long since lost meaning beneath 60. Then 100, then 200 feet of earth. The only measure of time was exhaustion or the extinguishing of a lamp. The deeper levels had thinner air. Men worked crouched, backs curved beneath ceilings barely higher than shoulders. And when gas pockets formed from decaying organic matter, trapped for centuries underground, one spark was enough to vaporize a room. There were no warning signs, only sudden absence where men once stood. Records from the medieval period suggest miners in the most dangerous sections rarely lived past their late 20s. Some died even sooner. A lifetime underground condensed into a decade of labor. Above ground, the towns around the mine were no better. Salt workers lived in cramped, low-roofed housing, slick with damp, dark even at midday with little access to fresh food because the soil was poisoned by runoff and salinity. Children born here carried deformities more frequently than in surrounding farmland, bones bent strangely, teeth discolored, growth stunted before adolescence. This was not considered tragedy. This was considered necessity. Far west, past the churning seas and jagged coastlines of Cornwall, tin ruled in the shadows of stone. Cornish tin had been mined since Roman times, and by the medieval period it became essential to alloy for bronze, to trade routes stretching to the Mediterranean. In the 1200s, the Standary Courts were formed to regulate mining, granting miners their own laws, their own prisons, their own harsh independence. Shafts in Cornwall were narrow and deep, following thin veins of tin through hard rock. Miners descended using rope ladders slick with moisture. One slip meant a fall that could break the body beyond recognition. In some shafts, ladders ran nearly vertical for over 100 feet. Hands bled from gripping frayed ropes day after day. Feet developed thickened skin that eventually split. Salt from sweat mingled with stone dust, eating at flesh slowly. Tin mines were colder than the surface world. Even in summer, breath came out visibly. Men wore layers soaked through by underground damp. Their clothes never truly dried. Rheumatism became a permanent companion, joints locked, fingers twisted, yet hands kept working, because stopping meant starvation. Poisonous gases, carbon monoxide, sulfur compounds, collected in pockets, invisible, scentless at times, miners would suddenly stagger, collapse, eyes wide with nothing in them, and the others knew better than to linger. The living abandoned the dying to survive. Women were often employed at the surface as ball maidens, crushing and washing, but younger girls and smaller boys were still sent underground in certain areas where narrow spaces required their size. Their education was replaced with rock and darkness. Yet the local lords and merchants praised the industry, calling it vital, calling it honorable, calling it the backbone of a land. Across Saxony, Poland, and Cornwall, the story echoed with different accents and the same result. Entire populations shaped by stone, graves filled early, hands scarred, lungs destroyed by the very material that made kingdoms wealthy. In 1492, the town of Annaberg in Saxony grew rapidly with new silver discoveries. By 1500, it boomed with thousands of residents attached to mine labor. Life expectancy in these communities did not rise with prosperity. It fell. Overcrowding, malnutrition, contaminated water supplies, and constant exposure to toxic elements like arsenic and mercury turned settlements into slow, invisible battlefields. Mercury, used in silver and gold extraction, poisoned those who handled it. Hallucinations plagued the miners, tremors in their hands, loss of speech, memory gone. A condition later called mad as a hatter had its mirrored twin below ground in men who had inhaled too much vapor. Priests would move through mining settlements giving last rites more frequently than baptisms. Gravestones marked with ages that should have belonged to children, 18, 21, 24, 28. Yet still more came. Because famine, war, and feudal obligation left few alternatives, better to die in rock than starve in open fields, better to cough underground than be cut down by soldiers above it. The church accepted donations from mine owners. Rulers minted coins from the extracted wealth. Cathedrals were built with funds carved from lungs, spines, and crushed fingers. What glittered above ground was paid for by those who never saw sunlight long enough to feel it warm their faces. And even on the rare days when work stopped, on feast days, on Sundays, silence did not feel like rest. Because every man knew the rock was waiting, the dark was patient, and tomorrow the ladder would still lead down into breathless corridors, down into dust so thick it swallowed sound, down into centuries of buried pain that never made into the histories written by clean hands. The mines didn't just take lives, they reshaped entire bloodlines. Children became shorter, weaker, ill sooner. Families learned to expect death before age 30. Women married young because husbands were unlikely to last. Grief quickened, love shortened. Hope narrowed until it only extended as far as the next payout and the next breath and the next step that didn't collapse underfoot. And still the picks struck stone over and over. Because the world above demanded what the world below alone could give. And the ground always answered with silence or with death or with another sliver of metal that made someone far away richer. While here, another life vanished into the dust behind a wall that would never again be opened, behind a shaft that no one marked, in a darkness untouched by memory, only layered, compressed, forever. Before the word leprosy ever reached the lips of physicians, the body was already being erased from society. The illness that crept along the skin with pale patches, then numbness, then open wounds that refused to close, was not merely a medical condition in medieval Europe and the Middle East. It was a sentence, a transformation from living person into walking omen, a being feared more than bandits, more than famine, more than war. By the early Middle Ages, roughly the 6th and 7th centuries, communities had begun separating those diagnosed with what was then called morbus lepri, later known as Hansen's disease. The belief was not rooted in science, but in scripture and superstition. The book of Leviticus described the leper as unclean, and the church, entwined with law, turned that uncleanness into ritual, into policy, into physical exile. By the 11th century, a time of swelling populations and tightening fears. Leper houses, or leproseria, began to rise outside city walls. They were built near crossroads, forests, marshy lands, or barren stretches no one wanted. Not technically prisons, yet impossible to escape without consequence. In France, England, Germany, Spain, and across the Levant, they multiplied by the 12th and 13th centuries. Over 19,000 leper houses had appeared across Europe alone, a silent constellation of exile. Each one housing bodies that still breathe, but were declared lost to the world beyond their gates. In many regions, a person diagnosed with leprosy was forced to attend their own funeral. A priest would lead them to church, a black shroud draped over their shoulders, a clod of earth tossed onto their body. The words spoken were the words for the dead from that moment. The law often recognized them as legally deceased, property transferred, marriages dissolved, children taken away, names crossed out from civil registers, and all while the heart inside the chest still beat. On June 16, 1179, the Third Lateran Council reaffirmed the Church's stance on isolating leprosy patients, stating they should reside in separate houses and not mingle with the healthy. Even earlier, on the other side of the Mediterranean, institutions in the Byzantine Empire and within Islamic territories had established similar segregated enclaves. Though compassion varied, treatment rarely did. Those who lived in leproseria were required to make themselves known long before they were seen, bells tied to wrists, clappers made of wood hung around the neck. In some regions, a metal rattle. Every step marked by sound, every presence announced as warning. If they walked down a road and heard approaching footsteps, they were expected to move aside, sometimes into the mud, into the ditch, in a thorn brush, until the passerby had gone. They could not touch market goods, could not enter churches, could not drink from town wells. In some French towns during the 13th century, they were forbidden to walk near streams that supplied water to the population. Not because the disease traveled in water. Nobody knew that, but because fear had become law. Inside the colonies, life moved in a strange stillness, small chapels for prayer, low stone or wooden huts, gardens that yielded wheat crops because the soil was poor and attention even poorer. They farmed when able, but many lost fingers, toes, sensation in their limbs. A simple wound became infection. An infection became rot. And rot became silent removal of pieces of the self, ears collapsing, noses shrinking, skin tightening over bone. The disease did not usually kill quickly. It dismantled slowly. Over 10, 15, 20 years, time enough to watch the body vanish in fragments. Time enough to remember every sensation once felt and mourn it daily. By the 12th century, the Order of St. Lazarus, a military and hospitaller order, became closely associated with the care of lepers, originally formed in the Crusader states around 1119 and formally recognized by the Church in 1142. The Knights of St. Lazarus were among the few who could move between the sick and the healthy. They ran leper hospitals near Jerusalem, then later across Europe. Their symbol, a green cross, appeared over many leproseria doors like a faded promise of mercy. Yet no order could stop the loneliness. No prayer could replace a child's touch, a lover's hand, a friend's unguarded closeness. In England, leper hospitals appeared along the main roads outside London. St. Giles in the Fields, founded in the 12th century, stood beyond the city's western boundary. Lepers would sit along the road during certain permitted times, bells resting beside them, and ask for alms. Coins would be tossed at their feet, not into their hands, food dropped like offerings to something not human. In Paris, dozens of smaller leproseria dotted the outskirts by the early 13th century. The most recorded was the House of Saint Lazare, a place spoken of in whispers, visited only out of duty or dread. Even doctors hesitated, believing the illness could travel through breath, through gaze, through divine will. Sometimes families attempted to hide an afflicted member, to delay what was inevitable. But once the signs became unmistakable, numb patches, ulcers, swelling of the face, loss of eyebrows, the community often forced the declaration. Neighbors reported neighbors, fear hid behind piety, and the church arrived with ritual words that hollowed lives. In the Middle East, under Islamic law, treatment was sometimes less strictly isolating, leper hospitals still existed, such as the Maristans in Damascus and Cairo during the 13th and 14th centuries. Yet stigma clung just as fiercely. Patients were separated for protection of the healthy, though charity was considered a virtue in Islam. Physicians like Avicenna in the 11th century described leprosy in the canon of medicine with notable detail, recognizing it as a disease rather than a curse. But recognition did not soften society's reaction. Crusaders, moving through unfamiliar lands, often equated leprosy with moral failing. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, often called the Leper King, contracted the disease as a child and ruled from 1174 to 1185. His body deteriorated as he reigned, fingers lost feeling, sight fading. Yet he remained on the throne, a living contradiction. A king marked by the same illness his soldiers feared and beggars. In villages across Europe, parents warned children to avoid the ringing sound, to cover mouths, to turn away. Stories spread that lepers could rot your skin with a touch, that they poisoned wells, that they conspired with devils. During times of plague or unrest, some leper colonies were attacked, burned, their inhabitants murdered by mobs convinced they were sources of infection for everything that went wrong. Yet the disease was not especially contagious. It required long-term, close contact. Often within families, the tragedy was rarely where people thought it was. In the leper houses, days stretched longer than years. Men and women learned to wrap limbs in cloth soaked in oil, to stop cracking, to carve spoons with hands that no longer obeyed, to speak through mouths reshaped by time and decay. They shared stories of who they had been: farmers, blacksmiths, wives, sons, priests, merchants, as if repetition could keep those cells alive. By the 14th century, as the Black Death tore through Europe from 1347 to 1351, fear shifted to a new enemy. And in a grim twist, leprosy rates began to decline. Some leper houses were abandoned, others repurposed. The deadliest pandemic humanity had seen stole attention from those already forgotten. Yet even as numbers fell, the memory of the bell remained lodged in the mind of society. A sound that meant separation, a sound that meant unclean, a sound that meant do not touch, do not look, do not remember. Still, life continued in these margins. Birthdays rarely celebrated, deaths barely recorded, only quiet endurance. People living in a space between breath and burial, communities within communities that history nearly erased, except for stone remains, foundation lines in the grass, a chapel missing its roof, a weathered carved cross with no name beneath it. And through every century, every shift of power, every crowned head and fallen empire, these silent and cloaked souls stayed where the roads curved away, listening to their own bells, counting time not by calendars or festivals, but by the slow unraveling of the body and the echo of footsteps that never came close enough to feel warm, only close enough to hear, before fading away again into a world that moved on without them, leaving only wind, only earth, only the endless waiting stretching onward without, and without closure, only the sound of distance ringing again and again and again. On July 7th, 1099, the first stone struck Jerusalem's outer defenses under a sun that refused mercy, dust lifting in pale spirals as wooden towers rolled forward over ground hardened by months without rain. Inside the walls, the air was already thin with sickness, wells tainted, cisterns nearly empty, and every mouth tighter, drier, silent with the knowledge that no help would come across the horizon. Raymond of Aguilers recorded that horses collapsed in the streets long before their riders, their bodies dragged away, stripped of anything that could burn, hoof, hide, sinew, even the bones taken for boiling. The city had been sealed off since early June, trade routes cut, pilgrims trapped, livestock slaughtered in the first desperate weeks, and then nothing left but dogs, and then the dogs gone too. By July 13th, the walls were cracked by constant assault, siege engines grinding, ropes fraying, men falling with arteries opened by arrows flashed silver in the light. Priests moved among the starving with prayers and dry mouths, confession for sins well understood. Chroniclers in later years described leather belts soaked and chewed until they dissolved between teeth, sandals cut apart for a hint of animal fat. Torah scroll covers stripped for glue that might pass as food. There was no law left to collapse. It had already faded like chalk in rain. Families broke apart quietly, a child slipping away in the night, a mother no longer stirring by dawn. Not murdered, simply erased by hunger more precise than any blade. On July 15th, 1099, the walls fell, the gates opened by fire and splintering wood, and the terror that followed erased what starvation had not claimed. Fulcher of Chartres would later write of blood reaching the ankles in certain streets, a detail not woven for poetry, but for memory etched into mind forever. Bodies lay where they collapsed, some still holding scraps pulled from the dirt, some still chewing even as life faded. The nightmare did not silence hunger. It only replaced it with something colder. A century later, Constantinople, the city that had resisted for 874 years, glittering dome of Hagia Sophia still rising against the sky, still adorned with mosaics of gold and saints who had long ago ceased to answer prayers. On April 9th, 1204, the Fourth Crusade turned siege into betrayal. Venetian fleets closing the harbor, iron hooks and ladders scraping ancient stone. Inside, the people had already been drained by decades of economic decline and political fracture, and by 1203, famine gnawed through the poorer districts. Grain stores vanished, prices climbing beyond reason. Even soldiers sold their arms for bread that wasn't there. By April 12th, 1204, when the final assault came, the city had been emptied of its strength from within long before the first invader crossed the wall. Nicetas Coniates described women grinding seeds found in horse dung, children scavenging riverbanks for weeds bitter enough to make a thin paste. Even the sacred pigeons of courtyards and rooftops vanished from the sky. When the Crusaders poured in, what little remained was taken, and then broken, and then burned, monasteries stripped of icons, libraries shattered, grain stores seized by soldiers who had never starved and could not understand what that hollow look meant in the eyes of those watching. The streets were not just ruined, they were silenced. The kind of silence formed by absence of children's voices, absence of merchants, absence of bells. Hunger lingered even after the conquest, haunting the city like a second occupying force. Survival meant bartering fragments of a shattered empire for handfuls of foreign grain, and those without anything to trade faded into doorways and corners, becoming part of the stone itself. Then Rouen, 1418 to 1419, during the long, grinding nightmare of the 100 Years' War. The English laid siege in July 1418, Henry V tightening the noose with chilling precision. No caravans entered. No barges reached the port. The Seine, once generous, now a closed artery. More than 70,000 people were trapped inside the walls. Too many mouths for a city cut off from the world. By autumn, the horses were gone, eaten or dead from lack of fodder. Then went the dogs, then the cats, then the rats that had once been pests and now became treasure. A single rat could be traded for silver, documented in letters from witnesses who watched currency collapse into flesh. Chroniclers recorded the scraping of mortar from between stones, the lime mixed with water, consumed as a mockery of soup. Bark torn from trees and gardens long stripped bare, boiled in a bitterness that burned the throat and still could not quiet the ache. On Christmas Day, 1418, no bells rang. There was nothing to celebrate, and no one strong enough to pull the ropes. The clergy marked the day in whispers, praying over people who no longer had the strength to respond. Some parents pushed their children through the gates in January 1419, begging the English to take them, to feed them, to let them live. The soldiers refused. Orders were absolute. Those children, over 2,000 of them, were left between the walls and the enemy, a frozen field of breathing ghosts, dying slowly in the open air while negotiations stretched on without mercy. Jean de Wavrin would later write of people found in their homes with leather in their mouths, belts, book bindings, saddle straps, hands torn and bleeding from chewing until nothing remained. He wrote of corpses appearing in alleys stripped not by wolves or soldiers, but by neighbors driven past the edge of memory and into something unspeakable. Not madness, but a desperate logic carved by starvation's knife. On January 19, 1419, Rouen surrendered. Those still alive walked out barely resembling people. Eyes sunk in skin pulled tight over bone, nails split and blackened. The city did not look defeated by armies. It looked emptied by time itself. Law had vanished months earlier, replaced by survival measured in hours, then minutes. These places were not mere battlegrounds. They were slow-motion tombs, where starvation became a ruling power, more effective than kings, more patient than generals, more absolute than any decree ever written. Chroniclers left their words as warnings, not wrapped in metaphor. Just raw lines carved into history's surface, leather-eaten, rats chased, bodies falling before prayers were finished, and the world moving on, leaving stone walls standing over ground that had swallowed everything, and still hungered, still remembered, still waited. In the spring of 1211, the ground of northern China trembled beneath tens of thousands of hooves, a vibration that reached the walls of Zhongdu long before the first arrow ever rose into the sky. Genghis Khan had already broken the western Xia. He had already driven fear from the Altai Mountains to the edge of the Gobi, and now the Jin dynasty stood before a storm that refused negotiation. The nomadic confederation forged after 1206, when Temujin became Chinggis Khan, did not move like an army of the settled world. It moved like a force of weather, sudden, everywhere at once, impossible to contain. Carpets of land that had fed cities for centuries were pressed into dust under horse and boot irrigation lines, cut carefully across generations, snapped open and choked with debris. Water ran uselessly into the earth or did not run at all. Fields turned yellow before their season. Farmers fled and found no border to cross, only open land filled with arrows that fell with terrifying calm. Entire towns between the Yellow River and the Great Wall were simply erased from the map, not burned and returned to, but hollowed until silence replaced memory. By 1215, Zhongdu had fallen. What is now Beijing broken under siege, famine, internal betrayal. Chroniclers speak about the streets blocked with bodies, not counted, not buried, because count had lost meaning. The Mongol armies did not pause. They rarely did, turning west toward lands that had not yet learned their name, lands that had no language for what approached. In 1219, a caravan arrived in the Khwarezmian Empire, Muslim Central Asia, governed by Shah Muhammad II. They came to Otrar as merchants, protected by Mongol law, but were accused of espionage and killed. It was a single choice small in the mind of one governor, and it shattered an entire civilization. Genghis Khan's response began that same year. By 1220, the cities of Bokhara and Samarkand had learned the price of insult. The grand mosques echoed with silence, madrasas emptied, and the great libraries, centers of learning for centuries, were reduced to drifting ash carried on the desert wind. Javani, the Persian historian, described Bokhara on March 1220. The doors forced open, defenders cut down, the Central Friday Mosque used as a stable for Mongol horses, its prayer hull thick with manure and despair. The minarets that had once called believers now stood in mute humiliation while the city bled beneath them. Samarkand followed. One of the greatest jewels of the Islamic world surrendered, then shattered, tens of thousands slaughtered, artisans taken away in chains, engineers forced into service, the rest dissolved into death or flight toward lands that could not possibly absorb them. Then came the long, terrible march across the Iranian plateau. Urgench, Nishaper, Merv, names once spoken with reverence, turned into synonyms for annihilation. Merv, captured in 1221, was said by some Persian sources to have lost hundreds of thousands in a matter of days. The exact number cannot be known, but the scale of destruction cannot be denied. Canals that had carried the lifeblood of Central Asian agriculture since the time of the Sassanids were smashed and left broken. Without them, the soil baked and cracked, and for centuries, no city would rise in the same way again. In Nishapur, a single death drew unimaginable retaliation. When a Mongol general's son-in-law was killed by an arrow from the walls in April 1221, the city's fate was sealed. Not simply conquered, but emptied. Men, women, children, animals, even some accounts say weeds were torn with hatred from the ground itself. Whether exaggerated or not, what followed echoed through the region as a warning. Resistance would not be answered with mercy. It would be answered with absence. By the 1230s, after Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the expansion did not slow. It intensified. Under Ogdi Khan, the Mongol forces swept into Russia and Eastern Europe. In December 1237, they reached Ryazan, and inside 5 days the city was crushed. The same story repeated through Vladimir in February 1238. Kiev in November 1240. The Golden Dome city, center of Eastern Slavic Christianity, was reduced to rubble and bones. Only a few thousand of its tens of thousands of people were left alive. Churches collapsed. Monasteries, centuries old, flattened. The Dnieper flowed past shores that no longer carried voices. By 1241, the Mongols had crossed into Poland and Hungary. On April 9, 1241, the Battle of Legnica in Silesia saw a European coalition shattered by speed and precision they could not comprehend. 2 days later, April 11, 1241, the Hungarian army was destroyed at the Battle of Mohi. Kingdoms stood stunned, unable to understand the enemy that never built a city, yet destroyed every one that stood before it. Villages vanished from records after this year, never reappearing. Entire regions depopulated so thoroughly that forests reclaimed farmland. Wolves returned to territories where fields had once been harvested by hand. In Persia and Transoxiana, the irrigation systems, some dating back to the Achaemenid Empire, never fully recovered. The canals destroyed were not rebuilt. The canal networks that had carried water to cities like Balkh and Herat became dry scars across the earth, visible even today. Crops failed not because of drought, but because the system that had made the land fertile had been smashed by hooves and iron and fire. Nomads replaced farmers. Empty land replaced towns, and the silence of displacement settled heavier than smoke ever had. Yet in some places, the Mongols spared those who surrendered quickly, demanding artisans, engineers, scholars. People were uprooted and marched across continents to build cities that were not their own. Chinese engineers found themselves in Persia. Persian physicians sent to Mongolia. Russian craftsmen moved to Karakorum. This forced movement reshaped entire populations, cultures twisted and braided through violence rather than choice. Still, for the common person, for the farmer, the clerk, the child learning to write letters in clay or ink, the Mongol expansion meant one thing: uncertainty so sharp it felt like a physical wound. There was no front line. There was no safety in distance. The steppes stretched everywhere, and from it came riders who could appear at dawn and leave nothing by noon. And long after the armies passed, after khans changed and dynasties fell, the land remembered. Cities did not return. Trade routes shifted. Knowledge centers disappeared. The demographic map of entire continents was rewritten in blood and ash. Lands once described by geographers as teeming were remarked upon, centuries later, as desolate. The scars were not metaphorical. They were etched into earth, river, and broken canal that still refused to carry water. Across Central Asia, across Persia, across Eastern Europe, a line of destruction traced the path of an empire built on movement and fear and absolute military dominance, and in that path, millions vanished not in a legend, but into dust, into unmarked ground, into histories written only by those who arrived too late to save them and too early to forget. For centuries, the North held its secrets behind ice and endless dark. a world where the sun refused to rise for months. And when it did, it hung low and weak over jagged fjords and frozen seas. Iceland, Greenland, and northern Russia were not lands of promise. They were tests of human endurance against a winter that seemed eternal. The Norse who sailed west from Norway in the late 10th century found Greenland's coasts jagged and harsh settlements at the eastern and western fjords founded around 985 under Eric the Red. They named it Greenland, hoping optimism could mask reality, but the name never altered the cruelty of the land. The winters were relentless from October to March. Darkness pressed against walls and roofs, cold seeping through timber, sod, and stone. Houses were small, insulated only by turf and stubborn walls. Hearths burned constantly, smoke thickening the air. Yet warmth never penetrated deep into joints already stiff from exposure. Fingers cracked, toes froze, skin peeled under frostbite, and when the snow drifts blocked paths between huts. Isolation became complete. A single family could vanish from the settlement without anyone noticing for weeks, months, sometimes never. Food was never plentiful. Greenland soil was thin, acidic, and frozen for much of the year. Barley failed, wheat refused, cabbages stunted, livestock struggled to survive. Cows, goats, sheep, their milk scarce, their flesh meager. Hunting was no reprieve. Seals and walruses provided meat and oil, but the ocean was dangerous. Ice floes could split beneath a boat. Storms arrived with little warning. And as winters grew longer in the 13th century during the Little Ice Age, even seasoned hunters returned. Empty-handed, hands numb, teeth chattering, stomachs grumbling with hunger that only grew fiercer in the dark. By the early 14th century, Greenland's Norse colonies were faltering. Letters from Europe indicate supply ships from Iceland, supposed to arrive every few years, became unreliable. Storms swallowed voyages, and when a ship finally arrived, its hold might be half empty, delayed by sea ice. Trade with Norway, which had once brought timber, iron, and cloth, dwindled to near nothing. Without iron, repairs were impossible. Axes chipped, tools broke, fences fell, and once guarded fields could not repel the wild. Winter took everything. Even survival on a single day was measured in brutal calculations. If the cows gave little milk, there would be no cheese, no butter, no nutrition for children. Parents rationed scraps, their bodies hollowing quietly while attempting to preserve the young. If a seal was caught, it might feed a family for 2 days, and then there was nothing. Sometimes families were forced to eat what should never have been eaten: dried fish with mold, leather softened by boiling water. Rarely, the desperate even consumed. Bones scraped for marrow. In Iceland, the winter darkness pressed differently, but no less cruelly. Storms tore across fjords in 1202, 1311, and 1340, described in the sagas as the night that devoured men. Snow buried homes, and the thin soil beneath sod roofs froze solid. Cattle and sheep died in their pens. Farmers trudged miles to cut ice for water, their hands blistered, lips cracked, stomachs hollow. Isolation was a weapon wielded by the North itself, a quiet, unyielding punishment. Letters from monasteries in southern Europe spoke of Norse communities struggling under the endless night, as if darkness itself could be measured in days and weeks that never ended. Northern Russia fared worse in some years. Along the Arctic Circle, settlements were scattered, no trade roads, no neighbors within sight. The winter of 1259 to 1260 is recorded in Novgorod chronicles as a famine winter, where rivers froze before fish could be caught, sledges creaked under loads of frozen grain that could not be milled, people boiled snow to drink, each sip costing more than thirst. It carried risk of frostbite to the fingers and burns to the tongue. In Greenland, by the 15th century, vanished entirely. Western fjord settlements abandoned by the mid-1400s. Eastern fjord settlements, once the largest, were gone by 1450. No letters survive from residents. No clear record of a last person taking a step. Archaeology suggests slow starvation, isolation, and environmental change intertwined with potential conflicts with the Inuit. Fields once tilled returned to tundra. Houses fell into ruin. Smoke stopped rising from chimneys. The ice reclaimed villages. The fjords returned to silence. The land erased the people as thoroughly as any war could have. For the Norse, isolation was more than geography. It was a slow unspooling of time. Every day was survival. Every night, a test of endurance against the cold and hunger. Children learned early the weight of darkness. How frostbite could claim a hand before a voice had grown loud. How meat was rationed with precision that often ended with tears. How the wind carried away not only sound, but hope. And yet they persisted for centuries, for decades, because the human body and spirit, however fragile, can stubbornly endure more than it should before finally yielding to the inevitability of frost, hunger, and abandonment. Ships from Europe occasionally reached the coasts. Iron, timber, and grain meant for repair and sustenance arrived too late. Storms destroyed vessels, wood rotted. Iron corroded, stone walls crumbled. The sea became an enemy as much as the cold. Each failed voyage left communities further tethered to the mercy of their own frozen world. Winter became a cage, the horizon a barrier, and Greenland's fjords, empty of smoke, rang with echoes of lives once lived, now vanished, yet marked forever by the hard ice, the unyielding snow, the darkness that lasted not hours, but months, and the human will tested beyond endurance until it broke completely. In October of 1347, the port of Messina on Sicily trembled beneath the silent invasion of ships from the Black Sea, Genoese galleys carrying grain, and stowaways no one could see. Fleas riding rats in every hold, buboes invisible in their tiny bodies by November. The first victims were dying in alleys and homes, faces blackened, swellings erupting in groins and armpits, vomit and blood mixing on the streets. And no priest could prepare the soul fast enough. No healer had medicine, nothing but the inexorable spread of death. By January 1348, Florence quaked under the arrival of the plague. The Arno River carried bodies on its current, floating past bridges and markets. The rich tried to flee. The poor could not. Chroniclers like Giovanni Boccaccio wrote that men fell down in the streets and died as if struck by an invisible sword. People barricaded themselves in homes, but even walls could not hold. Servants brought meals, only to carry disease to the family who had hidden inside. And soon, those walls were broken by coughs and fever, by the gnawing of swollen lymph nodes, by the smell of death in rooms never ventilated enough to remove it. London followed, the plague reaching its port in the summer of 1348. Entire parishes emptied, sometimes 3/4 of inhabitants vanished in months. Children, too young to understand fear, watched parents collapse. Neighbors disappeared overnight. The Thames itself seemed blackened by corpses. Healers, barred from understanding the disease, wore masks filled with herbs and vinegar. Their superstition no protection against the Yersinia pestis that moved through fleas on rats, humans, and the cities. Filth. Churches overflowed with bodies, grave diggers exhausted, sometimes throwing multiple corpses into single graves to keep pace with mortality. And in some areas, the living refused the dead, leaving them to rot in streets, doors, and yards, an entire city smelling of decay, of fear, of despair beyond reckoning. In Cairo, the plague arrived by late 1347. Chronicled by Ibn Battuta and others, Egypt's streets teemed with living who carried death as unknowingly as they carried water jars. Mosques became quarantine zones of terror. Markets emptied. Sultans attempted isolation measures that failed. The Nile, usually a river of life, reflected only the endless procession of coffins. The density of the city amplified the plague. One home infected another. Families vanished overnight. Children dragged away by servants. To avoid infection, sometimes never returned. Entire neighborhoods erased without record. Mamluk soldiers patrolled streets half empty. More specters than protectors, and no amount of prayer could still the shrieks of the sick. The epidemic did not respect rank or wealth. Merchants, artisans, priests, nobles all succumbed. Even the ruling families of Florence lost members. In Messina, Over half the population perished in months in Florence. Estimates range from 30% to 50% dead. London lost between 40% and 60%. Cairo, dense and tightly packed, suffered similar losses. Entire villages and satellite towns disappeared forever, leaving fields untended, livestock wandering, churches abandoned, wells untended, roads empty, echoing with wind and memory alone. Society itself began to unravel. The moral and religious fabric shredded. Flagellants traveled across northern Italy, whipping themselves publicly, convinced the plague was punishment from God. Priests refused to administer sacraments for fear of infection. Some towns saw lawlessness flourish, robbery and violence increased. Survivors looked on the dead with horror, then with fear, then with numbness. Boccaccio described how relatives abandoned one another, how grief became as isolating as death itself, how mourning sometimes lasted less than the time it took to bury the corpse. Bodies piled in streets, sometimes left to rot, sometimes burned in pyres that filled the air with acrid smoke. And still the disease moved on, faster than grief could process it. Hospitals, few and ill-equipped, overflowed, patients crammed together, nurses dying alongside patients, midwives collapsing beside the mothers they delivered. Children, orphaned by the thousands, wandered cities starving, sick, unseen. The very fabric of life had been torn and replaced with the raw terror of plague. By 1351, the first wave had run its course, leaving Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa a patchwork of emptiness, fields abandoned, crafts lost, families broken. Even those who survived bore scars of grief, trauma, and social collapse, and yet the disease did not end. It lingered, recurred in cycles, reminding the living that survival was temporary, fragile. Each day measured in fear, in vigilance, in the knowledge that streets once full now remained silent, save for the wind, the cawing of crows, and the occasional whistle of a survivor moving among the ruins, haunted by what had been and by what would never return.